So I'm going to talk about ActiveRecord and I guess going through migrations and how to do migrations, and I had to pick a domain to do it on. I've been looking at blockchain recently and thought, let's just see what could possibly go wrong. Blockchain's easy, right? So, good with things. So, for people who don't know anything about Ruby or Rails, ActiveRecord is a part of Ruby on Rails. It's the bit that essentially wires you up and helps you talk to a database. There's more stuff, but the big pictures, that's going to be what I'm talking about. So ActiveRecord is what you talk to a database with. Blockchain. So blockchain is kind of the foundational stuff that helps do all the cryptocurrencies. So after this, you'll be able to walk out, do your own ICO, and be making millions and millions of dollars. No. So it's actually really, really kind of cool, but really, really simple. Like a blockchain at its essence is just like simple stuff. So I'm going to talk about the simple stuff, and then there's building stuff on top of it. You add like the stuff to make it distributed. You add all the stuff to do all the extra things. So the blockchain is a linked list. You have a root node, you have a transaction or a collection of transactions, you have like a timestamp to say this is what happened at this time, and a proof of work to show that it really, a bunch of people have verified it and said that it's real. Your next node has a hash of the parent, and then the next node has a hash of its parent. So you kind of get that chain effect to see that, okay, this guy here, if it's got a hash of this guy, then that also includes the hash of this one, so you have a sort of verifiable chain of information that's happening. There's the proof of work stuff is actually then ends up being a hash or a number that's used to generate a hash with a lot of leading zeros at the beginning. So if you know, like a hash is like a bit of maths or a bit of crypto that takes in a big block of data and generates kind of like a small number. So people who use Git, you'll be familiar with like all the SHA, the sort of strings of characters that you see there. So if you've seen like the GitHub, you'll see like the commits that are there. Those are actually the hashes of the changes that sort of make up that commit, more or less. So, blockchain, we've got our nodes, we've got transactions, and timestamps, and proofs of work. Said that. So I'm not going to talk about all the cool stuff with blockchain really, but that's kind of the foundational. You can read more and learn about blockchain. We're actually kind of just using it as something to model and talk about ActiveRecord. So we're going to talk about and model within a database a block. So something that has a parent hash, a transaction. So I have to have a model which is a transaction. That link back to the other block or the other node, the timestamp, and the proof of work. So most of that is, some of that's kind of a mix of just data that's stored with that block, and some of it's the references to other objects, which Daniel will talk about. So transaction, I'm just going to model it. So all this is the simplest possible thing that you can sort of work with. So transaction's an amount from a user and to a user. We're going to have a user with an address. So just like a postal address, so you know how to contact them, an email, first name, last name, and an address. It's going to have lines, city, estate, and postcode. Okay, so that's lots of stuff. I'm going to do that in some code. Okay, so I've got a Rails project that has not much. So if I do a git log, you'll see that I did the initial version, and there's a hash. Initial version, added a Ruby version file, added in a couple of useful dependencies, and some console magic. So that's our simple project. So I'm going to do a Rails G of a migration. So I'm generating a migration, so I probably should be a little bit more complete. Type in generate. Okay, so that's created a file, which is our migration. So migrations are the way of taking your database from where it currently is to adding in another table to store stuff in. So it's actually one of the kind of nice things with Rails. Okay, so we've got our addresses, and it's Command-Shift-P. Okay, so on our addresses, I had a text of lines. I'm going to have a string of a city, string of a state, and they all need to be symbols. I want to have, I think I said a postcode. So what should a postcode be? String. Not an int. No.
It would be a string.
So why string? Why integer?
It's postcodes that start with 0 in Australia.
Yeah, that's
Well,
probably
you
pretty
could
good.
have letters in postcodes as well.
Yep.
Yep.
Overseas, you can, yeah.
You're not doing any.
No math.
Yeah.
Okay, so no math until we do. Okay, so I should be able to just do hey, we've created our table of addresses. That bigger as well. Okay, so I'm not touching anything apart from just the migrations in our ActiveRecord. So I'll open up a Rails console. I haven't actually created the ActiveRecord yet, so I'm going to go in. Okay, so Rails C is Rails console.
You ran migration.
So I haven't created, so I've created, so the migration that I had, so there I ran that migration file, so it creates the table. I haven't actually told Rails how do I map to that table that I've created. So the migrations are all about how you upgrade your database to the new and add new tables, or add new columns to tables, or add those new definitions. And then the models are going to be how we map that from code to actually interacting with the tables that you've created. So within our models, I'm going to create a new model and create a new file, which is our address.rb. Rails 5 sort of world, so I have to send application record, and that's our address. So if I do a reload, so it gets all the changes, and then I can print out, and that's our address definition. And so you'll notice that the object that I have defined as an address doesn't have anything in it. It just knows to pull its definition from the database. So that's kind of the magic that Rails does. So the migration that we do, again, I'm kind of reiterating again and again the same things. But the migration is saying how you upgrade the database and the definitions in the database. Then the application, the active model, which extends from application record, is how it sort of stores that.
And if you actually had a database query happening there, you would actually see that it actually would have hit the database.
Yep.
And actually ask what fields do you have. So it's totally interactive with the database.
Where did the column ID?
So, good question. So, actually, let me.
Well, it's
So,
weird. Like the first time you use it, like where'd that go from?
yeah. So one of the things that Rails kind of likes is a bunch of sort of, one of the mantras of Rails is convention over configuration. So one of the things that you're going to want to have in a database is a primary key to reference, like, here's the unique identifier for this object, this bit of data that's sitting in the database. And so Rails has a convention that there's an ID used for that primary key, and that it's going to be of an integer type.
Is there anything that it's hiding from us when you do that? This thing? Is there any other fields?
In the database?
Yeah.
No,
in that table.
no, because we
No.
generated them.
Which fields are you thinking of? In particular?
Created a timestamp. No, because.
No, I didn't do timestamps.
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't do timestamp?
No.
No.
Okay.
So, one thing that actually is really common that you want to do is do a t.timestamps. And so one thing that I can do then is I can do a redo of the migration, so that reruns the migration again. And if I do a reload here, and do an AP of the address, it'll do the timestamps there. So the timestamps are really sort of nice, useful columns to have in a Rails model, because then within your controllers and the Rails sort of code happening behind the scenes, it'll automatically populate those with the things that it sort of says. So like the created app will have when you created the record, and the updated will be updated every time you do an update to it.
Is redo an alias for rollback and then migrate, or does it drop and then migrate the whole thing?
It's a rollback and migrate.
Oh, okay.
So it redoes the last one. Okay, so we've got our address. Next is user. So user references the address that we just created. Also has, I'm also going to have an email, first name and a last name. So I'll go back to our console. Okay, so one of the things that is sort of happening with these migrations as I'm doing them, it's again looking for that convention. So if I'm doing a creating new tables, what it's going to do is sort of be helpful and be automatically knowing that, hey, the class that you're creating is called create user, so therefore there's going to be a table that you're going to be creating called the users table. So the way it knew to do that was because when I did that command line to say create the migration, I called the migration create user. Okay, so our users table, I think I said email. Doing it wrong. Thank you. I think these are all strings. Names are hard. I'm cheating. Yeah, I guess if you're thinking about an international thing, then first name and last name probably isn't really what you want. And so we're going to see two different ways of doing things when I reference back to that other object, that other model that we had. So I'm going to say t.references address. So that's saying that our user object that we create is going to reference back to that address. So a user has an address. So we can go here and see if my migration works. And it works with the help of Mitchell. It wouldn't have without. And so I can go in here and create my user.rd file. And it's a class user extends application record. And the bit that I was talking about before, the user belongs to an address. So this is a way that we sort of help the code to know that that address that we were talking about before, that it's related to the user. So we've got these two different objects that are sitting there in our ActiveRecord code. They're going to relate, and there's a relationship between the user object and the address object, which then we'll see in the database in the users table and the addresses tables. So hopefully I've got it right. can see our user. And so we can see our user, it ends up with an address ID. That address ID is for the people who care about databasing stuff. An address ID is going to be a foreign key that references the ID column on the address table. So as we were talking before about, and it's conceptually that, whether it gets implemented in that depends on stuff that we're not looking at. But yeah, so our user references back to an address, and that's again, that convention is that you would have the belongs to of that address will look for an object that's of type address. Okay, so that sort of covers our user object. The next level up is the transaction. And so this is kind of going to break what we just learned a little bit, because there's two users on one transaction. And so we can't just do that same kind of references approach, because there's two different things pointing back to that same user object. So I'm going to, from looking at what we had on this one, we ended up with an address ID. What I'm going to create then is a from user ID and a to user ID. So if I go to our terminal, we'll do a Rails G migration transaction. What is that?
Create transaction.
Create transaction. Thank you. So we go back over here, and we've got our create transaction. So creating
Kind
our
of doing that in the command line, and so you don't have to do all that, like creating the records from there.
Yeah, so you can also then, so there's more advanced stuff that you can do with putting stuff on the command line, and it kind of means that you're not, it generates more stuff for you. I can do, okay, so the other thing that we're talking about was, before was,
You have migrated.
Yeah.
You want to do
Migrated? Okay.
You want to do a Rails destroy.
Just keep going.
There we go. Okay, so you can put everything in one line, and I'm not going to bother because it's actually easier just to do it in code.
No guts.
And yeah, so you can also, there's also a bunch of other things that you can do to generate stuff and make it quicker and easier if you want to. If your mind works in memorizing lots of commands and memorizing lots of stuff, then there's a bunch of stuff that Rails will do to help you make it easier and quicker. If you want to just see stuff, and there's all the different steps in finding out the ways that work best for you. So at the moment I'm just doing it, this sort of simple way here. Okay, so we are creating our transactions.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Probably really stupid, but why have you got the two sections? Why is it? I don't know anything about
In this screen here.
Yeah.
So that one, it's actually just two different terminals or command windows. And so I've just got it split in half. The screen split in half so that I can easily sort of see two things at once. So I can just kind of go there and do the Rails sort of command line, the generation of the migrations. And then down the bottom, I've got the Rails console. So the Rails console is like one of the really cool things. And I think with Rails is it gives you an easy way of doing code that interacts with your whole sort of code base. So I've got all these sort of models that are sitting here. There might have 30 or 40 different sort of models. You might want to see what happens if I do this and make these kind of changes, and I want to write some experiments to see what happens. So the console lets you kind of type the code and sort of see it and evaluate it in sort of, I guess, in a text sort of way that lets you see it sort of straight away. Here's the change. Oh, it does that. And it lets you try out some of the different methods. So you might be looking at a string that says something like hello. You think, okay, yeah, I want the hello to be, I think I want it to be uppercase. What's the way of doing that? And so it lets you sort of type and sort of see and explore what's happening. And so it lets you do that against so it knows all of the sort of standard Ruby sort of libraries for you to be able to do that stuff with. and then you can sort of include everything and pull in all the stuff that you've got within your code base to, I guess, try out methods, see how they work, see how things work, and just do sort of little experiments. So I think a lot of the programming can be writing these little experiments, working out how that works, and then sort of squeezing out all the bits that you don't need, and working out what you do need, and then putting that into your sort of software. And then,
Upcase first.
sorry?
Is it upcase first?
Well,
They used to
yeah,
It's,
always
that's-
capitalize.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. What if you have two
Capitalize
words?
does all the words.
There we go.
Well, like capitalize does all of the words.
Yeah.
I guess it was just the first.
Sorry.
Okay. Yep. And then there's also, I think,
Is it
There are
Ruby or support?
There are so many aliases for things, it's ridiculous.
yeah. So, I mean, I think a part of using, it's kind of weird with that one weird. But, okay, so I guess a part of this is like within Ruby, there's, some documentation which kind of gives you some idea. You'll be wanting to write tests to really sort of give you confidence in what your code does, but you also want to just write little experiments and just see.
And if you're not running a Rails app, you just use IRB instead of Rails console. You won't be able to access any of your database stuff. You won't have a database, you're not running Rails, but you can do all the same stuff with the Ruby methods.
Yep. What she said. Okay. So our transactions table. So we've got our transaction is from someone to someone, and it's for an amount. And I'm going to pause. So money is something that is kind of important to get right. There's
As long as it's always in my favor.
So, so I'll pause. How do we want to do an Australian dollars currency?
Float.
Okay, so float is the wrong answer. There's no wrong answers except for that one. Okay, so float is a floating point number that's not actually represented as a decimal number. And so you're going to get small little rounding errors that people are going to care about when it's money.
Is it big decimal? That's what we use where I work.
Yep. I'm going to cheat.
She's integer.
Yes, keyword concerns.
Start it in a sentence.
Do you want like precision 40 or something?
Yeah, I want something that looks something like that. So I'm doing Git stuff. Git is cool. You'll want to learn Git at some point. Okay, so Git is really nice for, like, if you're working with a team of people, Git's awesome because it lets you kind of manage all the different changes that different people are working on. If you're working on something by yourself, it's awesome because it lets you keep track of all the different things that you're working on by yourself and go back and forth to different versions. So I just went back to a version of this that I've been working on last night, pinched a bit of code that I knew was there, and now I can put it back in. So an amount with a precision of 8, so that lets us get up to millions of dollars in a scale of 2, so there's 2 numbers after the decimal point. So for an Australian currency with just straight dollars and cents, that's not rubbish.
Which way do you round the money though?
Sorry?
Shut
Someone's got to get cents, so this is our transactions are going to be actual money.
Anything income, it rounds up. Anything outgoing, rounds down.
If you are storing real money and you are like a bank that's computing interest or things like that, you actually, the one way that I've seen it done a number of times is to use not integers but longs. I've seen it used as integers, but that ran out of money.
Yeah, with Ruby Postgres at least anyway. You can still use an integer. You can just provide a length, and it will convert to the suitable database type.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to run the migration. So it's created our transactions table. So creating a transaction, the class of transaction extends the application record, belongs to a from user with a class name of user. I think that's about right. So, yeah, that's simple place. Didn't not compile, so it must be right. So as I flippantly say that, this would probably be, we're getting to having enough code where you probably should be thinking maybe a little bit about tests. I'm not going to do that now because that's not the point of what I'm doing. But yeah, I mean, you should be actually testing and learning what's happening to your code and writing sort of automated tests around it. Particularly, I guess, maybe not against your specific application records that you're creating, but against the controllers, against the the sort of end-to-end tests that actually start to add value is more and more where it's at. So I'm looking at people telling me controllers is probably the wrong word to be using there, but it's more the integration level tests that I think add a lot more value. Okay, so we've done our user, we've done our transaction. How long do you want me to talk for?
What's your goal in the upcoming window?
So I've got one more block that I can do, and then I can just close up.
Keep going. I've got
Keep
like
going?
5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So we'll do again.
Do you want to explain a bit more about what happened with the class name and why? Instead of just moving class name.
It belongs to user from user.
Okay. Yep. So in our user, we said that it belongs to an address, and there's magic which says that the address that you belong to is going to be looking for a class in the models of type address. So it's looking for this, and it just knows because it's got the same name, it's the same, so it's going to use one of them. There's sometimes when you can't do that. So if I look at our transaction, there's 2 users. So I can't just say belongs to user because a transaction has a from user and a to user. So I've had to say, okay, I've got a from user and a to user. You probably don't want to have a separate class for both of those because it could be the same person. That sometimes they might be receiving money, sometimes they're giving money, so they're going to be the from and to sort of moving back and forth. So you want to always be a user that it's being represented by. And so that's where that class name is used to sort of get around that magic that automatically does that mapping and be explicit and say that the class that you're using for this from user and to user is the user. And so that's what the transaction is for. The other thing that we can start to do is think about the relationships going the other way. So you have from users.
Transactions.
Yeah. As many
You can do like from transactions.
from
Then you have to say,
transactions.
then you have to say in first or something. I could be wrong.
Back credits and debits.
Very good.
Naming's always the hard bit.
It's hard. Okay, so about now is where I would now go to the internet. Actually, it's not this one, but so a decent size, and it's maybe not going to work, so I can talk about what I would be doing. But a decent part of programming is actually your Googling skills and being able to look up both how to do things and think about, like, you know, this is the problem that I want to solve. Okay, I want to be searching how to do a has many relationship when the table doesn't match the definitions. So I'd be looking up maybe has many as a Rails has many as the sort of search that I'd be doing. And that would end me up at probably the Rails guides, maybe one place where it might end me up at, and then maybe at the ActiveRecord sort of documentation, and start to look at some of that. It's probably going to end me up with a bunch of Stack Overflow questions and answers that are going to be some really useful and related to what I'm doing, some are going to be really old and not the right answer. So it's, I guess, a bit of it's sort of working through things like that.
That council thing that keeps popping up, you probably need to like
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah.
It's also handy if you are Googling to put in the Rails version.
Yeah.
Because like things like
Turn
these
Wi-Fi
sort of
off
examples
and
do
then
change quite a lot between Rails and native version.
Yeah. What he said. It's a good thing. So the guides.rubyonrails.org has lots of really good stuff. The things that we're looking at are how things are associated with each other, so the ActiveRecord associations is where we want to be. Really just the has many association is what we're looking at here. And normally, has many association reference. So there's, on all the Rails guides, there's, go back there now that I've just got to where I wanted to be. On all the Rails guides, on the right, there's the chapters, which kind of gives you here's where everything is. And so normally actually down the bottom there is those association references, or the references for whatever bit is being talked about in that guide. I don't know that this is actually what I want.
Do you need both sides, or can you just use one?
So you can just use one. So we need to say, so depends on how you want to be using the code. So if you always are going from a transaction to the users, but if you don't need the side that we've already got, that belongs to side. But if you, as a user, want to say, give me a list of all the transactions that I've initiated that I'm the from user for, you want to have that has many relationship that's specified on the user as well.
Isn't it you adding as many transactions? Oh, wait, you want to call it? What do you want to call it? From transactions? There's like has many transactions as from transactions, and then it will just do the rest.
Yeah, it's not going to play with the way that we've got it modeled at the moment.
Yeah, because you're gonna rename them, right? Oh, that's right. You model this one. I don't know.
Can you do has many transactions and then do has many from transactions through transactions as user or whatever it is?
Search for inverse.
What you do is you have a credits and a debits table and you join together.
This is how I do mine.
Is this like a reference the code from a previous employer?
Yeah, close.
Rob was my employer.
Okay, so I can say that the class name is going to be a transaction.
Just the cat story.
Well, command one.
Command one.
Hide your menu.
And then command one again. Should go away then.
Sorry, if you want me to hide the menu. Sorry, if you just tell me what you want me to do, because my keymindings are not match yours. It's
You can kill the universe off.
So
Foreign key. Change foreign key.
yes.
Become a marker.
Okay. So that's our user relating back to transactions, and we get to see the has many relationship. So what that will do is it will give us, by having that has many, it will mean once we start using that user object, we will get lots and lots of methods on our user. So maybe let's just try. So this is less than useful to see 431 possibilities. One of the good things and the bad things with Ruby and Rails is that there's lots of methods that are being sort of sitting there. If I had prior set up, it would let me go in and look a bit closer, but it's not quite set up properly on this yet.
Call public underscore methods. Give you a class.
And there's lots of methods.
Minus object on methods.
That's making this too hard. User.methods.reject.
Okay, so actually what I can do with that is,
Laugh is very helpful. Yeah, see, it's the same thing.
But you could have seen crap.
so we can see that there's lots of transactions. There's our from transactions, so we can assign the list of from transactions, which will create the appropriate relationships. We can get the list of the from and to transactions. We can add on a single transaction to the list of transactions. There's a whole bunch of stuff in Power that's given by doing those, short little bits of code that are there. So that's our transactions. I could dive into the blockchain, but it's essentially the same thing again. If you want more information, you want to learn about blockchain and stuff, Bitcoin, there's a paper that talks about it. There's ActiveRecord. The guides from Ruby on Rails are really good. Props to a guy who did a Haskell version of rolling your own blockchain. So if you're interested in Haskell, that's an interesting article to read. If you're not, then don't go there because you'll your mind just the Haskell syntax, let alone any of the crypto stuff. And then at the bottom, the standard libraries for Ruby, we provide the functionality for doing all the digesting stuff, which is the primitives that we, like the crypto stuff is going to be based on. Yeah.
So can we book you in for next month, which will be the follow-up, which you actually show some data, and then how we get between different data points?
Sure.
So back and forth, that'd be awesome. Everyone would like to see that?
Yep.
Awesome, okay. Thanks very much.